This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the Humanities Teaching app. Today we'll be doing our third installment of Soren Kierkegaard's The Concept of Anxiety. Joined with me today is Bob Schut. He is going to be our discussion leader. I've been having a little bit of some audio issues on my end, so I'm going to let him drive most of this conversation and weigh in here and there, but it's largely going to be the Bob show today. So Bob's going to be talking to us about sections 4 through 6 of the first chapter. If you guys are interested, I just did sections 1 through 3, which is up on the Noetic app now, and we'll be back next week with a few more installments. So without further ado, here's Bob.
Okay, well, hello, everybody. I'm going to start with section 4. I guess it's called section 4, but just as a reminder, the title of chapter, the whole chapter here, kind of brings us back to the point. Anxiety as the presupposition of hereditary sin, and as explaining hereditary sin retrogressively in terms of its origin. So basically, what we're trying to do is get the subject back to what was hereditary sin? What's a good definition of it? What does it mean? And it appears that Kierkegaard didn't exactly see it the same way that the Lutheran Church saw it in Denmark. And so this is what he's writing about here. The concept of the fall is basically this section here. Up to this point, Kierkegaard has actually offered us little in the way of exactly what the sin was. And I found that kind of baffling as I was reading through it. I kept thinking, I can reread it, look at my notes and say, no, I don't yet see where he's actually defined what the moment of sin was for Adam. And I thought, well, maybe it's because he's just first trying to show, give us that present understanding of original sin as somehow being hereditary is a faulty conclusion. You know, like arguing his point by first proving the other point is faulty. But then I got a commentary. Luke was gracious enough to send me a commentary. And I found that in the commentary, it says that he doesn't actually tell us what causes the sin of Adam. So he doesn't actually give us that point that I've been looking for. So I felt kind of somewhat relieved that the problem wasn't with me. The problem was simply he doesn't tell us what it is. So we have to now kind of refocus a little bit, at least I do, to find out what he's trying to do is tell us what's wrong with the present understanding.
I would say this. Commentators are not infallible beings, right? So,
right.
The commentary that I sent you, it's very good. It's from a very reputable source, but I'm not so sure I'm ready to give up on the idea that we can't identify this sin through our course.
Oh, I think that we can, but I think that Kierkegaard does not give us that to us like in one nice little sentence, one nice little paragraph. I think he talks mostly about what it is not, and then can we come up with what it is based upon what it is not? And that's going to be his more indirect method, right?
Right.
How do we come up with what he's trying to tell us it isn't? So we have to work a little bit, or at least Luke and I have to buy my highlighters by the dozen now, because my pages are practically every sentence is highlighted. Every time I read it, I highlight more of it. So the more I read it, the harder it gets for me. Starting out, though, my own thought is that, and this is kind of contra Sartre's idea, my own thought is that man sins when he realizes his independence from God and that he exercises that freedom. Now, Sartre kind of thinks freedom is the best, greatest thing we can have, being independent, being a self. That's what life is all about. But I don't get that from Kierkegaard. I don't think Kierkegaard is saying that. I think Kierkegaard is saying the exact opposite, that our freedom and our independence is actually closer to the sin than closer to being what God intended us to be, based upon the story here. Right. How does that fit with you, Luke?
The only correction I would say, and we're largely concerned with Kierkegaard, but everybody I think who's been following along knows that we've started to dabble in some Sartre and that we're working on exploring some of Sartre's existentialist plays. I would say Sartre's not so optimistic about the nature of freedom, right? There's always that man is condemned to be free. He just subtracts the theological dimension from it. But I don't necessarily think Sartre thinks that existential freedom is a wholly good thing, right?
Well, what about authentic freedom? I know he doesn't think that bad faith is a good thing, but what about authentic freedom? Do you think that that's his whole role he's trying to play? At least most of his philosophy is to get people to be independent and become individuals. Yeah,
but I don't think it cures everything. I don't think it's a panacea.
Okay.
But I don't know, there's a lot more work I still have to do on Sartre. I don't want us to give the impression that Sartre is just all roses.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and I think the more he lived and the more he wrote, he changed and he developed as well. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint him and at one particular time. But just wanted to give you the idea as kind of to see how it fits in with Sartre. So at this point, I kind of see it a little bit more going against him than for him. So we're talking about ignorance, and some of the things that we're going to talk about today have already been discussed slightly, and that's kind of Kierkegaard's style. He kind of throws the seed, and then he lets it grow a little bit. So we're going to talk about things like innocence versus ignorance, which is we spoke about last week a little bit, or actually it wasn't last week, Tuesday. To remember that ignorance is even being ignorant of one's innocence as well as ignorant of the self. So when we speak of ignorance here, usually we think of it in a less than complimentary way. You don't usually call somebody ignorant if you're trying to compliment them. But here, ignorance has a different role for Kierkegaard. It's being ignorant of yourself, being ignorant of good and evil, as being innocent. So he speaks of innocence and ignorance as being almost the same thing. And this is going to play an important role as we get down to a little bit further in this. He makes a distinction of the guiltiness of the individual as well as the guiltiness of the race. And so we touched on that a little bit last week, that the race is kind of an abstraction. There's not really anything called the race, but it's a thought, it's a concept. And we place guiltiness with the race, but we place guilt with the individual. So he makes that distinction. One is quantitative and one is qualitative. The sinfulness of the race, he puts in that category of being quantitative. Our second, third, fourth, fifth sin really doesn't do a whole lot. It adds to our sinfulness, but it does so in a quantitative manner. It doesn't do so in a qualitative manner. It's that first sin that really changes the quality of man, at least dramatically in the sense of a leap. The rest does kind of change the quality, but it does so incrementally. So he puts that more in that quantitative category. As far as sin goes, as an act, it rests upon the responsibility of the individual and not the group. We cannot repent for Adam's sin. We can't repent for the sins of humanity. We can't repent for the sins of the race. We can only truly repent for our own sin. So this is a difference. This is one of the differences, that we have to take sin personally. Sinfulness kind of comes along with being a human being. Sinfulness is the guilt of the many, while sin is the guilt of the individual. And he says this. He says that only Christ could take on the sins of, or the sinfulness of humanity, the sinfulness of the race. And I thought about that, and I thought maybe in the eyes of Kierkegaard, Christ began a new race, like the saved would be a different race than the unsaved. in the terms that he's talking about. Because remember, he talked about Adam. If Adam sinned because it was hereditary, it would be a different race.
Yeah. So I think it's an interesting idea. I just don't know when that new race would occur, because it's not like Christ gets rid of hereditary sin within the single individual. Like, I still have sin in me, even though I'm a professing Christian. I still fall away from faith and still sin. So I still have, I guess what I'm saying, I don't see the break between myself and Adam, at least as a biological creature. Now, well, could I be reborn somewhere else and have that sinfulness extricated from my being? Yeah. And I think you're talking about on the other side, there being, not necessarily being human anymore, but at least in a temporal sense, I don't know if I would say that Christians would be set apart.
Well, I don't mean it in one way, but in another way I do. That, for instance, Paul uses terms, you've become a new creature, you've become a new person. Does that imply entering into a new, what might be defined as a race? When Christ says you have to be born again, is he talking about being born, in a sense, in a new race? The race of the forgiven. Those of us who are born again are forgiven, as opposed to those who are not born again or not forgiven. And, I don't mean it race meaning in the way that we take it. I mean in the way that Kierkegaard is speaking about it. The race as far as sin is concerned. So it just in that way only, not better. I don't mean it be that people or Christians are better than other people. I just mean it's a different way of looking at it. It's so different, so radical, that we have such a different relationship with God that it's almost like saying it's a new race.
I understand. I understand this. I'd be hesitant to affirm the idea it's a new race, because I think in order for Christ to really have generated a new race, he would have needed to procreate in some way, right? Like, we are connected to Adam because we have sort of a biological nature that's passed down from Adam, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas Christ, we don't have that necessarily from Christ. The transformation that occurs from Christ occurs spiritually.
Well, it's a spiritual race. I don't mean it. Yeah, and I didn't mean that it was a physical entity that we somehow got, like going to communion, by taking the body and blood of Christ, we become a new race. I don't mean that. But I mean it in what you're saying, the idea of a new spiritual being. And those are the terms that are used in the New Testament, a new spiritual being. That almost implies a new race. It doesn't say it specifically, but that's how I mean it, a spiritual race.
I think there's got to, I'm sure there's like Dan Brown, Da Vinci Code stuff, where they're talking about like how like Jesus actually had offspring or something like that. And I'm sure you know more about it than I do. And I think there are historical traditions where people actually thought that monarchs and patriarchs were descendants somehow from Jesus, as some sort of different kind of race. I wonder if that's where this idea of divine right came from. Merely just speculating. Something I did find kind of interesting is how you mentioned how we cannot repent for someone else's sin and so whatnot. And I know you've bounced around to a bunch of different religious traditions. Growing up my entire life as a Protestant and not really subscribing to any other denomination, it's always been perplexing to me the role of saints within the Catholic tradition. I think you were born Catholic, right?
Yeah.
You were Roman Catholic?
Yeah, I was raised Catholic.
In the Catholic tradition, I think my Catholic friends have told me that is it possible for saints to intercede on the behalf of someone else's sins? You can pray to a saint for someone else's sin within the Catholic tradition. Can you speak to that at all, or are we getting way off course?
Well, no, I could speak to it a little bit. The idea, and of course, it takes different forms, praying to saints and asking, for guidance and forgiveness and stuff. But the whole idea was that it's like a bank where the good deeds go into the bank. The good deeds of the saints go into the bank. And if you commit sins, you need a little forgiveness. You need a little goodness. You go to the bank and you take something from what the saints have put in the bank. So there's kind of like a reserve here. It's how that works. It's kind of like that scale. The Catholic Church has more in their reserve of good deeds from the saints, so we can kind of use some of that, those saintly good deeds to help us out.
So saints are a little bit like a rainy day fund. I never really thought of it that way. But
yeah, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's kind of the gist of it.
What about praying for not the salvation of non-believers or something like that? Is that something that happens much within either tradition of Protestantism or Catholicism or anything like that? I suppose God can do anything.
Yeah, I don't remember being taught anything like that about praying for that. I know that in the Mormon faith they do more of that than they do in the other Protestant denominations. But what Kierkegaard is telling us here is that when we pray for forgiveness, we can't really pray for the forgiveness of other people unless they repent. I mean, we can ask God that he might forgive them. In my own personal prayers, I'm very careful of that issue. I pray that they are awakened to their own sinfulness and that they know what they've done is wrong and that they confess it. Because me asking God is really asking that the person repents for his own sin. He's not going to be forgiven because I ask God to forgive them. You know, and I know people might be thinking, well, what about Jesus when he said, forgive them for they know not what they do? Didn't he pray for the forgiveness of other sins? And yes, he kind of did, which was a reflection of who he was. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if they didn't repent for those sins, that they'd be forgiven for their sins. He was just saying this particular situation, this particular issue of the crucifixion and what they're doing to me, don't hold it against them because they're deceived. They don't know what they're doing. And that probably opens up a whole lot of theology right there. Yes. I don't know if that's been resolved yet, but that's anyway just kind of
God having a little conversation with himself on the cross.
Yeah, that opens up a whole lot of area. But
these digressions are ultimately super fascinating, but we have a task.
I'll try to go ahead here. So we go next into how do we lose our innocence then? So and everything here, I have a kind of a note to myself. A lot of this stuff is very speculative right now. What he's just kind of dribbling out information to us. So I'm adding some speculation here myself. So it's easier if you read the text and you'll know, you'll probably understand why, because that's the only way I think we get from point A to point B is with a little speculation. He thinks that psychology can be of use, as well as science, and even ethics and dogmatics. But we can only take so much from these ideas and methods, that we can't allow them to go beyond the point of their usefulness, especially in the scientific community. Psychology can only take us so far into the religious world. So he thinks that we're in the religious point of view, and while we're there, psychology can only help us a little bit. It can't help us when we start getting into terms of forgiveness and divine forgiveness anyway. Then he brings up this man called, I think it's Ustiri, and I tried to find something about him, and I couldn't really find anything about him outside of what Kierkegaard talks. But the reason I'm even bringing him up is because he brings about the idea that the prohibition that was given to Adam and Eve when he said, thou shalt not eat of the tree of good and evil, that prohibition was what actually brought about sin. And that was the idea that he had. But Kierkegaard tells us that this theory kind of breaks down, and he's going to tell us why. But at first it kind of sounded kind of fascinating. Maybe it was the prohibition that kind of awakened in Adam and Eve their sinfulness. But he says, no, not quite. Doesn't quite get us there. And then he gives us a warning, and he kind of tells us why. He says, he warns us about being careful how we interpret the Bible because of ideas that were taught to us. They create a foundation that we feel we need to preserve. So if we come from a particular denomination, or whether we come from Roman Catholicism, or whether we come from Mormonism, or the Jehovah's Witnesses, we have a certain foundation that we create of what beliefs we're going to believe in. And therefore, we're going to interpret the Bible based upon those foundations. So we've created a kind of vision for ourselves, or a lens through which we're going to interpret the Bible. And he tells us to be very careful when we do that. And it reminded me of Piaget. I don't know if you've ever studied Piaget. If you go into the teaching profession, that's one of the psychologists you have to study. And he brings up this idea of the difference between assimilation and accommodation. How do we take in new knowledge? What do we do with it? Well, we can assimilate it, meaning we can take it and bring it into our present knowledge of truth. And we may have to tweak it a little bit and force it, but that's assimilation. We bring it into what we already know. Or we can accommodate it, meaning we can change what we already know to allow this new information to fit. So two different ways. So he's telling us, be very careful how we assimilate the scriptures and how we accommodate the scriptures. And then page 40 of our text, he gives us this quotation. As a person does not bring himself into the awkward position of having to understand the explanation before he has understood what it should explain. And I really like this quotation. I don't know if this jumped out as you as much as it did me. Is that we have to first be sure that we understand the question before we answer it. And I know a lot of times when I was in college, my essay answers would always kind of start answering the question, and then slowly they drift off the topic. And I thought, man, what a great essay I finished. Unfortunately, I didn't answer the question. I answered my own question that I recreated. And I'm sure that as a professor, you've probably run into students always doing the same thing, right? They start off answering the question and slowly drift off into a whole other world. Did you have that problem?
Oh yeah, totally. I totally guilty of it myself too. Think it's not exactly natural, what it is to do some of these academic assignments. I mean, heck, I probably still do it. I was while you were talking, I did a little bit of research on Usteri. I don't know if you have any interest in hearing just a small segment.
You found something? Yeah, go ahead. If you found something.
Yeah, you were saying there seems to be an interesting book out there that correlates pretty well with what we're studying here. It's called Anxiety in Eden, a Kierkegaardian reading of Paradise Lost.
Oh,
and
okay.
I'll just read this paragraph from it. I found this through Google Books. It's $128. It's really rare, so I don't know how many people can afford it. But it's just, I quote this passage: freedom's possibility, writes Kierkegaard, is not the ability to choose the good or the evil. The possibility is to be able. I believe it's on page 49 of the Concept of Anxiety. Since an instant Adam and Eve cannot know exactly what they are able to do, anxiety fixes upon possibility itself as the object. This, as I have explained, Kierkegaard calls objective anxiety. However, even pure objective anxiety requires some wrinkle in innocence that provokes the sensation of possibility. For this reason, Kierkegaard speaks favorably of Leonard Usteri's view that the prohibition itself constitutes a conditioning cause of sin, so long as the prohibition is thought to awaken only anxiety and not evil desire, and of Franz Bader's view of the temptation as freedom's necessary other. So I just thought that was kind of interesting that God's restriction, it sounds like God's restriction may awaken the possibility.
Well, yeah, but he was careful enough to say that it was only awakened the anxiety, not the sin. And I think Kierkegaard would agree with that. That's what he's trying to say here, is that we can take that psychology up to a point, but we have to be careful not to go too far. He says if the prohibition is a precondition for the fall, then it also sets up the condition for inordinate desire. And this inordinate desire is not actually the sin. So the forbidding of the prohibition kind of makes us want it even more. It's like, this is where the expression the forbidden fruit comes from. When you tell me I can't have it, all of a sudden it looks a whole lot better. I want it a little bit more. So I think that's at least we can relate that to that expression. Is that Adam wouldn't have sinned if God didn't tell him, do not. So you have to be careful. In other words, we don't want to go to the point where we're thinking that this would have prevented Adam from sinning if God never had told him not to do it. Did this awaken an awareness of his own will? I can't help but to think that there might be something to it. So I agree, kind of like Kierkegaard did with Usteri. It made him aware of his own will, or at least the possibility of a will being independent from God. It, however, did not cause the sin, but gave the possibility to it. So in my own understanding, I guess I would have to say I'm pretty close to what you just read there, that it brings about our understanding of the possibility that something's going wrong. But we're going to go into that a lot more before we call it a night here. We talk about the role of temptation, and he uses the word concupiscentia, which is an interesting word, right? Concupiscentia. I had to add it to my spell checker because it couldn't find that word. I guess it's Latin, would be my guess. But what it means, concupiscentia, is a term that they use in theology all the time. It means a strong sexual desire, a lust, a desire for the lower appetites. And it's something that happens prior to guilt and prior to sin. It is not sin itself. He says that the qualitative leap becomes weakened or enervated and becomes successive, if that would be the case. In other words, what he's trying to say is if it were something that caused the sin, then we would find ourselves getting closer to the sin by degrees until finally we had enough to commit the sin. And that would mean there was some kind of intermediary, and we'd be back in the quantitative area. It would be steps that lead to the sin. But he's saying, no, it's not steps. It's a gigantic leap that we take. Steps aren't involved here.
Well, how do you reconcile this idea of, how do you say this word again? Concupiscentia?
Concupiscentia, yeah.
I just think of, Jimmy Carter. It's when he talked about lusting in his heart, and that was just as bad.
Oh, yeah.
You know, how do you think it relates to that whole idea that that desire in itself is some sort of sin?
Well, desire brings, I think we'll be answering that indirectly, okay. but that's okay. I need to respond to that right now too. I think that we're speaking not of his first sin, not of becoming a sinner, but we're already in the quantitative side where we continue to sin, and yes, temptation does have that step effect. It adds on to our sinfulness because sometimes our sins can become greater. Like our third, fourth, fifth sin might be worse than our first sin. But there we're adding on to our sinfulness. We're not adding on to our sin. So that I would agree. So he says, does concupiscentia cause sin, or is it simply concomitant with sin? And concomitant is a word that we use to say, is it just something that goes along with it, related to it in some way, but not necessarily cause and effect? And that's one of the questions he's bringing up for us to kind of play with a little bit. He says, if it is in fact a cause, then it would make sin a succession of levels. It would be quantitative until we actually or gradually become tempted enough to encounter the fall. So that's why he's saying it's not this, and it's not this, and it's not this, because the reason is it produces a quantitative step to the fall rather than a gigantic leap. And it's going to become very evident why it needs to be a leap. We can't see how this clearly relates, however, to being a cause right now. It's true that the forbidden fruit is more attractive, but this is not a cause for sin, which lies a lot deeper. It may be a temptation for sin, but not for the first sin. So we have to make sure that we understand the difference between the first sin and successive sins. Is kind of like different rules attached to that. So now we go back to the idea of innocence, temptation, and lust, and kind of mix it all together here. We can see that Kierkegaard is developing the idea he started earlier in saying that this desire through the prohibition stands as an intermediate or a mediate between innocence and sin, which is he's trying to discourage it from standing between the two. I believe that he'll show us that no mediate is necessary for the first sin. Now, in the Protestant church, he says, we're taught that hereditary sin is something that we're born with, right? I think you even just mentioned that hereditary sin, you're born with it. We're born with concupiscence and without the fear of God is the way the Protestant would probably explain it. You're born with temptation and you're already born a sinner. That's why babies need to be baptized. It makes us think that Adam's innocence is different than man's innocence. If man even has an innocence. So we have to say, could man ever have experienced innocence if he was already born with sin? And if he did, and if he was, then there is no leap, and Kierkegaard is totally wrong.
Maybe when I was in the womb.
Well, there's theories that by simply sucking on the breast of your mother, that it's a sign of total egotism, a sin of egotism, because you don't want anybody else to have the breast, just you. This is your breast, nobody else's. I mean, I've heard that even as an explanation as why an infant is a sinner. But you know, I'll leave that for now. So
yeah, if we want sinless babies, feed them formula.
Yeah. There you go. So we're born with the potential of will to either join to God through faith or to act independently. So that's kind of my own little comment, but I'll just kind of put that off to the side. Okay, so we go to section 5 here. And this is interesting. He talks about the spirit of man is dreaming. We touched on this at the end of lesson 3. And he says that this agrees. This idea of the spirit dreaming is kind of fascinating. And he says this is actually in agreement with the biblical view. He says that when man is in the state of innocence, he has no knowledge of good or evil, or good and evil. He didn't even know that such a thing existed. Now, I want to make it clear, because I don't think anybody else makes this point clear. It's not a knowledge of good or evil. It's a knowledge of good and evil, which means Adam, when he was created, had no idea of the whole concept of ethics. There was nothing good, nothing bad. It didn't even enter into his mind to be totally innocent, because he didn't know good and evil. Because that's what the tree was going to offer. It wasn't just knowledge of evil, which is what a lot of people kind of take it to mean. It's a knowledge of good and evil. So that kind of might change people's idea of how they view this. Kierkegaard picked up on this, though. So he was saying there's nothing but peace and repose, nor even a striving to be good in man as he was created. There was nothing in the area of ethics.
But this is and I want to hear your take on this, right? Because things happen before Adam and Eve ate of the apple, and you'll get to it, I think, in section 6 or later here in section 5. One of the things that Adam did, right, was to name the animals, right?
Yes.
So he had knowledge of something, right?
Well, he had knowledge, but it wasn't good or evil. It wasn't ethics.
Well, what would you say? Well, I'll let you answer it, but I want to just put this question here. I'd like to hear what you think, how you would categorize the type of knowledge Adam had before the apple.
Total innocence. In other words, he had no idea that there was even such a thing as being bad or being good. All he did was obey God. What God said, he did.
But
Made the animals, okay.
But would you say Adam had language?
Well, that was one of the things he brings up. But
I'll let you address that.
Well, he had a way of. I didn't actually go into that too much because it was kind of not on point so much. I had to drop a few things. That was one of them. But the idea was this something that Adam was telling himself, or was he hearing the voice of God? We really don't know. But did he have language? He had language in the sense that we would say he was able to put ideas into words, whether they were spoken words or concepts, don't know. But language in that sense. So yes, I would say he had what would define as language.
Well, I mean, it raises very interesting questions about what is language, right? Like,
yeah, it does.
Not all language is audible, right?
Right.
Like sign language. I mean, is there sort of nonverbal language? I mean, it seems like there can be. Is there thinking without language? Do you have to have language before you can have thought? Do infants have thoughts before they have language acquisition? So this is a fascinating area of research.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I would say he does have language, but he doesn't have a language that includes the word good and evil. Let's put it that way. So he's innocent in God's eyes and even in his own. But what he does have is anxiety. But that's not sin. But Kierkegaard says he has anxiety. At least he has the beginnings of it. But that's the interesting part here. And then he goes into this dreaming spirit, and he gives us some convoluted explanation of what it is.
It's pretty beautiful.
Well, it's beautiful, but it's almost incomprehensible.
Well, isn't that the nature of beautiful things?
Yeah. Not if you have to give a discourse on it, though. Okay, so I tried my best here. This dreaming, meaning that man is projecting his actions or his future actions, who he will become, what he will become. He's dreaming in the sense that innocent tries to look beyond the present, but there's nothing there. The presence of anxiety is evidence that we have the means, but we're not able to actualize it since we have no object of our anxiety. It's a fear, but currently it's a fear of nothing. A better word might be the unknown. So for me, the dreaming spirit, and I know the commentator gave a different explanation, slightly different than what I'm going to give, but I see the dreaming spirit as a person who is still forming, just kind of not quite comprehends who he is as an individual. So he's still kind of in this dream state of who am I and what am I? And he's projecting, what will I be? What will I become? Which is the object of anxiety.
Right, and we see that in children, right? That makes sense, right? We see that as a developmental stage within children. I mean, I still see it within myself. I'm 37 years old, and I'm like, what am I going to be? I know it's not totally the same thing, but I have two questions for you. First off,
okay.
Just so people can play along at home, so they have a home version of the Noetic game. Because the commentary I gave you was an anthology of commentators. Do you recall off the top of your head which commentator you're referencing?
Yeah, it was the first one, because I usually start a book, not always, but I usually start a book at the beginning.
It's a very special edition what I gave you. Isn't it from the?
It's called the International Kierkegaard Commentary, and the editor is. What's the editor?
It's probably John.
Robert L. Perkins is the editor.
Okay.
And the first one is Stephen Dunning. Kierkegaard's systematic analysis of anxiety.
Cool.
And he has a whole bunch of them, but that's the first one I read, and then I had to stop, but I plan on reading more.
Did you like it?
Yeah.
Was it helpful?
Yeah, and it was helpful because wasn't going from a commentary. I was just going from what Kierkegaard means to me. So I was a little apprehensive of reading a commentary because I think sometimes they can poison us because we have a tendency, well, I better agree with the authority. So I'll have to, force my, but he agrees with me and I agree with him about pretty much everything that we've said. This point here of trying to explain the dreaming spirit, he goes into another one of Kierkegaard's works. I forgot which one it was, but he goes into another one of his works where he says Kierkegaard speaks about that. But I'm not sure he means the exact same thing in that other work. So I'm kind of going with my take on it here. And it's interesting you brought up children because Kierkegaard does compare it to a child, the anxiety a child has of growing up. And I thought, yeah, children, they want to be just like their parents. They even dress up. They put their shoes on, their hats on. The girls dress up as mom and the boys dress up as dad. But yet there's still an apprehensiveness of being that with the responsibility that goes along with it.
Yeah.
So they want to grow up, but there's an apprehensiveness about growing up. Is that kind of what you meant?
Yeah. It's also interesting. Simone de Beauvoir talks about this issue in The Ethics of Ambiguity. She talks about, she invokes this idea called metaphysical privilege. And so if people are interested in seeing a different sort of understanding of this idea. The second question that I had was, I think Kierkegaard said that man has to be the synthesis, this triad, but of oh God, what makes he says that spirit
Innocence?
is this?
Yeah.
Well, right. So
body and spirit. Yeah.
Yeah. That man has to have this spirit in him, or otherwise he'd be just like an animal. Mm-hmm. That animals don't have this, whatever spirit is. I'm not really sure what spirit is, but I seem to remember him making the remark, and correct me if I'm wrong, that animals don't have it.
Right.
That an animal can't have anxiety that would act in a way that would lead them towards sin, towards fall. Yeah. Can you elucidate that distinction at all? I mean, I know it's difficult.
Well, I do get into that a little bit more. I kind of postponed it, but I'll mention what it was, and then we'll know when we'll recognize it when we get there. It's the synthesis between the body, which was in Greek the soma, the body, the physical body, and the psyche, which is the psyche. So it's when the psyche, the mind, or whatever we want to think of psyche, also translated as soul, but here he means psyche, and the body somehow come together to form a synthesis to create a spirit. It's an ongoing dynamic. It's not like they produce a spirit, pops out, and now is separate from the body and the mind, but rather it's an ongoing production, which is very important to understand where Kierkegaard is going with this. So we have to understand the synthesis as a dynamic that's continually going. Yeah. And the spirit right now, he's saying, is kind of still in slumberland. It's still kind of not quite there yet.
Well, this is interesting to me. So on Kierkegaard's view, animals have a soma and a psyche. They have a body and a soul, but they don't necessarily have the spirit. And I'm wondering, because I think a lot of this comes out of The Sickness Unto Death. There's this very ironic Hegelian depiction of this concept about the relation relating to itself and all this stuff. You probably know what I'm referencing to. Does the spirit is spirit part of man to begin with, or does it evolve out of its mind-body relationship, its soul-body relationship? And if it does, why it doesn't happen in animals? What is it about?
Okay. To answer to the second question first, I think that the dynamic is I'm sure that there's a word for it, that this synthesis is going on from that man is created as this, and the dynamic is right there, right from the very moment of creation. He's a mind, he's a body, he's a synthesis. So there wasn't a time when he was not a synthesis. It's just the synthesis is becoming mature. Now, in defense of my pet cats, do they have a spirit? I think yes, they do, but I don't think they have the same spirit. Now, I don't know if that's exactly what Kierkegaard say, no, you're wrong, or no, you're right, or yes, you're right. Yeah, I think I've seen in the pet dogs that I've had, and if you've had any pets, I see a synthesis, but I don't see it. I don't see that they have a human spirit. But I think that they have a synthesis going on, but that's just a subjective opinion. Do you know? Your father's a veterinarian. You've probably been around animals a lot. What would you say?
Well, I've definitely seen it's interesting. I think when you look at, I mean, this is just pure. It's not like I have right. It's not like I have my father's veterinary knowledge or anything like that. But growing up on a farm, it seems like there is a big difference between domesticated and undomesticated or non-domesticated animals. It would seem to be the case that it seems like when you domesticate an animal, it starts to take on human culture in some way. Like, we have, every once in a while, we'll have like a wolf or a coyote around here or something like that. And it's, that animal has no conception of right or wrong, of morality or whatever. It's just like, I'm going to eat your animals to survive. It doesn't think anything about shame or anything like that. But then if you have a dog and it goes and gets into the garbage and spreads the garbage all around, and like, and you say bad dog or whatever, it will actually express something that resembles guilt.
Yeah.
It knows it's not supposed to do that, and it does it anyway, and then it feels guilt because it knows it's not supposed to do it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, you don't see this in uncivilized creatures. You don't necessarily see this in wolves, but you will see this in dogs. Just, whatever.
Wait a second now. In a wolf pack, you have a hierarchy of wolves.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
Yeah.
And the wolf at the bottom, he's the one who creeps up and, he doesn't want to mess things up. He has a sense of guilt, right?
Yeah. You'll see this with primates and stuff like that, with the alphas and stuff like that. So they have their own little cultures there.
They do.
So maybe it's all there. I think the interesting thing is as I was talking about this difference between domesticated and undomesticated animals, I started to think about, pre-civilized man and civilized man. If you're talking about, before civilization comes into existence, you have men that don't have spirits. Yeah. But I guess by your claim that culture is always there, I guess in a way you preserve the spirit of the human race.
Yeah. It's always an interesting question, where animals fit into this. So it's certainly worth exploring, right? It was kind of fun talking about it.
It'd be a good term paper for someone. That'd be a good term paper.
There you go. Yeah, somebody's looking for a subject to write about. There you go.
Yeah.
And he talks about anxiety, loss, and change. I think what he's getting at in the previous comment about the sleeping spirit is that the anxiety is an unsettled feeling of anticipation of something that's going to happen or might happen. His independence. So perhaps for Adam, it was a sense of anticipated loss of his perfect bliss, or a change that had not yet manifested itself. Kierkegaard really doesn't go into that here, but anxiety is evidence of some kind of anticipated change. Change causes anxiety in many of us. I think that when people suffer from anxiety, isn't it usually tied to fear of change, fear of the unknown, but the unknown in the sense of change? In other words, like, do I have to make a decision? And what decision do I make? And what will my decision, how will it affect the future, my future? And just kind of stressing out about all of this. What college do I go to? What classes should I take? And you stress out because you don't know the impact of what they're going to have upon your future and how it's going to affect your change. So isn't that a kind of anxiety that we're talking about here? Or am I reading too much into Bob into Kierkegaard here, or is that what you think Kierkegaard is telling us?
Yeah. I definitely think that. I think the question is that does that totally define anxiety? That definitely is. I would say the most total form of anxiety. But then where do things like nervous disorders fit in? Like, I don't make this a big secret. I've definitely had, an obsessive compulsive nature. You kind of have to build something like an internet company based around ideas. But I mean, it manifests itself in the most irrational ways that it's not really at least directly a fear over an unknown, right? Whether it means checking locks or whatever sort of in my past, whatever sort of compulsive behavior that I would engage in. But maybe indirectly it's related to this fear of change and unknown and trying to exert some sort of control over things that we can't control. It just doesn't always seem, it doesn't, at least it doesn't always seem that way, but maybe it ultimately can be traced back to that.
Yeah, it may manifest itself like that, but there's a whole medical side to it as well that I can't explore because I just don't know enough about it. But so now we're going to actually talk about that a little bit more. My next topic here was, what is anxiety again? It's in my notes. The concept of anxiety is not really treated in psychology, which is kind of an interesting term, an interesting way he studied, at least maybe in his day. It's different from fear, which involves something actual. And then he has a quote here. He says, anxiety is freedom's actuality as the possibility of possibility. So we could probably end right on that. That explains it all, doesn't it? Anxiety is freedom's actuality as the possibility of possibility.
Crystal clear. I think we solved all the riddles of the universe in that one quote. Bob, I really thought that this project was limitless, but I guess you just explained everything.
Just in that one quote, huh? I went in one of the I think it was in the commentary, he mentioned that somebody thought that this was a typographical error. They couldn't figure it out. They thought that he made a mistake in this error and he should have meant something else. But he's right. This is what he's trying to say. He says, I can choose to act as a self, is what he's saying. The possibility that something might possibly happen. In other words, I have a possibility of doing something that might possibly happen. So it's a possibility of a possibility. At this point in man's existence, he doesn't know what to fear, but yet has the capacity to fear. He may have a fear of change. He doesn't know what will change, but only that change might come. This fear may also be an indication of a faith issue, which Kierkegaard doesn't really mention here. Is this anxiety really tied into faith? I think it is somehow tied into faith, because I used to be very anxious about lots of things, but I find my anxiety wanes now because I have more faith in God. I don't need God to prove everything to me. I don't need to worry that things are going to work out because I have faith they will work out. So God is kind of curing my anxiety here. But Kierkegaard, at least here, doesn't talk about that, about how do we get above our anxiety. So that was one thing. He doesn't really cure it in this chapter yet. Anyway, he's just trying to identify it first. At this point in man's existence, he doesn't know what to fear, but has that capacity to fear. There is nevertheless a freedom of possibility within man, perhaps an unconscious sense of freedom to be a self. So I think that he brings this all together eventually to show that anxiety is really a fear of the freedom to become a self. I think he's going to put some meat on these skinny bones here in a little while.
Well, can we see how, just from the little bit of research that we're doing on Sartre, can we see how Sartre may have been influenced by this idea?
In which way? Be a little clearer on that?
Well, I don't know. In terms of developing concepts like bad faith and not properly
Oh,
making use of our freedom and whatnot, and the nausea that is associated with becoming a self, and these other sort of concepts.
Yeah, I think he definitely makes the connection. At this point, I'm not sure that I agree with Sartre in his conclusion, but I think that he comes to the idea about the synthesis idea and about this anxiety and fear of the unknown. I think that's all captured in Sartre. So it's obviously Sartre got that from Kierkegaard, but I think he takes it a little bit off on a different route. But we can explore that, if not here, in some of our Sartre stuff.
Yeah, we're evolving Sartre scholars, so I would.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should really have an expert on at some point who knows Sartre and Kierkegaard equally well.
We will have one, right? We will have an expert coming on.
Yeah. We will. Yeah, we will. We'll.
Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Next, he gives. Now, I don't know if everybody's heard this quotation. I know we've done it on the air. It was on page 42. It's just one of the quotations he's famous for. It's the anxiety is a sympathetic antipathy and an antipathetic sympathy, which is what's called the attractive repulsion. What attracts us repels us. What repels us attracts us. Sounds like kind of a dating service, right? The best guys for the women are the ones who repulse them the most, and the same for the guys, right? I don't know. But anyway, this is the attractive repulsion. Anxiety in Adam must have been subconscious. It could only be spoken of after it was made manifest. So Kierkegaard thought that Adam, although he was in a life of bliss, he still has this sense of anxiety, of fear without an object. It was a possibility that was not known. Again, I think that this is a fear of change. In other words, I think Adam, in the state that he was in, even though it was bliss, it was like saying, okay, I'm in this state of bliss, but how long is this going to go on? Is something going to happen to disturb this? What might happen? That's the picture I'm getting from Kierkegaard. How could you be in anxiety and bliss at the same time if it wasn't for fear that you were going to lose your bliss? What do you think? Am I on the right track there?
You mean you're having trouble comprehending how you can feel two things at once?
Bliss, how you can feel anxiety in a state of bliss, and the only thing I could come to was a fear of losing bliss, a fear of the change that would come about that might affect your bliss.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't know if it's completely analogous, but I know that there is a sort of it's been a long time since I've known bliss, Bob, so I'm going to be real about this. I kind of surrendered happiness a while ago. Not that I'm some sort of super melancholic dude, but I've pursued meaning instead. But I do recall when I was happy and when I did something of bliss, that there was always the desire to preserve it as long as possible. You knew that it was unsustainable. Yeah. Right. So I guess this is what going in, like, why anxiety is coupled with bliss, because you know that change is built into it. Right. It's not always going to be that way. And I think maybe that could speak to why codependency develops in a lot of romantic relationships, is because people there's something very finite about it that makes people want to just hold that much harder onto and micromanage and control one another. And but I'm projecting.
No, I think you're right on the right course, because I think you're going to bring us to where I'm going to take us eventually here, to kind of flesh that out a little bit too. This anxiety is not guilt, he says, and it's not a troublesome burden. It's within the blessedness and the innocence. So he takes us back where you wanted to take us, to childhood. He says that anxiety is a kind of drive to motivate us, or to motivate us to move and to do something, as in a child looking for adventure. It sounds like he's explaining what we might call curiosity, anxious curiosity, or maybe support of the change theory, where the child is looking for change, but at the same time, he's a little afraid of where it's going to bring me. It's kind of like looking around the corner first. What's around there? I want to see before I actually go there. The child wants change, but at the same time, there's something holding him back. Although in my children, there wasn't always something holding them back. They seem to have not too much of a problem going out with the change, but that's what parents are for. So if anxiety causes guilt, then man is still innocent since it was caused by something foreign to him. So innocence doesn't cause guilt. This whole thing is going into. It can sustain itself within innocence without causing guilt. So let's go down here. We've also have to consider the idea of seduction by the serpent. Now, I don't know how carefully everybody has read this story. But if you read it very carefully, you'll find out that was the serpent the cause of Adam's sin? Was the serpent's temptation or his seduction the cause of Adam's sin? And the answer has to be no. Why? Well, first of all, Adam never spoke to the serpent. Eve is the one who is tempted by the serpent. And was she tempted? The word is actually not tempted or seduced, but the word is she was tricked by the serpent. She was deceived by the serpent. So these are the kind of the technicalities of the story. Adam didn't commit the sin of taking the fruit because the serpent convinced him to do it. It was because Eve offered it to him and he simply took it. Eve was deceived, but Adam wasn't deceived. So I don't know what that has to do with the willfulness of the sin, but Eve isn't so much blamed for the sin as Adam is. And I think the reason is her sin was less in a sense.
Well, how could she be tricked? It's not like the serpent said, "Oh, this apple will induce no change." I mean, the serpent says to Eve, right, that it will make you like God, right?
Yeah.
What?
But let's remember.
Where's the deception? I guess.
Okay.
Where's the deception there? Is the serpent wrong?
Yes, but you got to remember where Eve is starting from. She's in innocence, and what does innocence mean? She's not aware of deception. If she was aware of deception, she wouldn't have been innocent. See? So she thinks that whatever anybody tells her is true. I mean, I went through my whole childhood like that. I believed everything everybody told me. I never thought people would lie to me until I got older. Parents don't lie to you. Adults don't lie to you. But you find that out later in life. So Eve is in that kind of vulnerable position where this being is talking to her and says, "Oh, is that what you..." No, God didn't actually say that. Well, God said, if you eat of this fruit, you'll be like gods. You'll be like he is. And she says, "Oh, maybe that's a good thing." So that's why she was deceived. He told her what he needed to tell her to get her to disobey God. That's why it was a deception.
What was the prohibition? You have to refresh my memory the exact wording of the prohibition that God gave Adam and Eve. Like, didn't he say, like, if you eat of this tree, you will die? Was that?
You shall surely. Yeah, if you eat of the tree of the fruit of all the trees in the garden, you may eat freely, but of the tree of the fruit from the tree of good and evil thou shalt not eat, because when you do, on that day you shall surely die. That's not a direct quotation. That's kind of my hopefully a close reproduction of it. So the idea was, the prohibition was, don't eat of the fruit because in that day you will surely die. Now, it was a prohibition, but we also have to think, was that a punishment or was that a consequence? The word punishment isn't in there. So a lot of times we kind of speak of it as, well, they were punished. But in my reading of it, the word punishment isn't in there. it's a consequence of their action. So whatever that might influence somebody in the story, we have to read the story. And I've always found that story fascinating, because when you read it very carefully, like Kierkegaard warned us, a lot of times we're taught things about that story that just ain't true.
Yeah.
You know?
So I'm going to throw a grenade at you.
Oh, okay.
All right, here comes a grenade incoming. What did you make of Kierkegaard identifying difference between Adam and Eve in regard to this issue? Because I'm trying to remember what he had to say here, but I think he says that woman is more sensuous in some way, and that this affects the deception in some way. Did you just kind of chalk that up to, like,
no, he talks about that
gender norms of that time, or do you think it's even worth dwelling upon thinking about man and woman differently in this regard to temptation?
I do deal with that grenade. I throw myself on that grenade. So we'll have to see what happens.
Okay.
But I do actually in my outline here cover that. But we don't, even Scripture doesn't say man sinned because of Eve. It doesn't say that Eve is the one through whom we inherit sin. Adam is always blamed for it. It's the sin of Adam, the hereditary sin of Adam. New Testament puts it squarely on Adam's face, not in Eve's face. Okay. Now, Eve suffers consequences because of what she does, as does Adam, and they both die as well. But they do suffer different consequences. As we'll see, Adam has to work and toil the soil and gets little results back from it. Eve is going to have more pain in childbirth, and she's presumably going to have to search for her mate and find her mate. He'll have authority over her because she was the one deceived. Those are consequences of the actions. We might think of them as punishment, but I think we're adding a layer there if we do. So I feel safer in just saying they're consequences of disobedience. But we'll kind of get into that other question a little bit here, and then we can talk about it a little bit more. Now back to synthesis of the self. Here's where man is a synthesis between the psychical and the physical. A synthesis is unthinkable if they're not united in the third, which is spirit. This is what he says. Such a synthesis is a dynamic force rather than a state. So it's not a state in that the synthesis took place and it's over, and now we're just spirits. It's a synthesis that's a dynamic force. It's ongoing. And the spirit is present but not complete. So it is as though we were in a dreaming state. The spirit disturbs the synthesis. He says it. But I would say it changes the synthesis by influencing the dynamic. So the spirit is a result, but it reflects back into the mind and the body as well. So you've got this triad that's kind of self-communicating and influencing the result, the synthesis. So he talks about relating itself to itself. He talks about this also, I think, in the sin unto death. No, what's the other one? I can't think of the other one. I'll think of it in a minute. He talks about this in another work, in a very elaborate explanation. How does a spirit relate itself to itself? So we'll talk about this reflection of spirit back to spirit. So if we have a spirit going through time, living, maturing, we reflect back upon ourselves. We have that mirror quality about ourselves, don't we? We think about ourselves as we used to be, as we were just 10 minutes ago. As soon as we're done here, I'll think back as to some of the faux pas that I said while I'm online and think I wish I had that to do over again. But that's the spirit speaking. And he says, what is that? What is that force between the spirit? It's anxiety. That's what he says anxiety is. It's the spirit reflecting back on itself, the spirit relating itself to itself. And I think that's a very poetic and very marvelous way of thinking about anxiety. This dynamic force of anxiety, it's what keeps this development going. It's the process of maturity in mankind. Yet it's also a fear of becoming a self. The innocence, the anxiety, and the ignorance and the fear are all tied together, or as he calls it, or entangled. So this is why it's a leap. We have all these things coming together. And the best way I kind of described it a little bit later on, it's like an explosion. You have to have the ingredients to have an explosion. You have to have gunpowder. You have to have some kind of a spark. You have to have some kind of a container. You have to have other chemicals in there. And neither one separately and of itself is an explosion. But the explosion happens when you have all these things together, and at one moment, you have that explosion. The leap is the same thing. It's when you have innocence, anxiety, ignorance, fear, everything ready to blow, and bang, it goes off. All at one moment. It's a big leap. It's not a step. So that's the best way I have of kind of explaining this. The ignorance is one that's qualified by the spirit because innocence is anxiety. The innocence is nothing. I'm sorry, the ignorance is nothing. Or I like to call it the unknown. Would you agree with me that, and this is kind of where, again, I'm putting Bob into Kierkegaard's mind. He uses the term nothing. But to me, it's not so much nothing as it is the unknown. Would that be okay? Do you think I'm reaching too far to equate unknown and nothing here?
Well, for starters, I want to say that I really like your analogy about the explosion. It's kind of like the way that you put all these different parts together makes it sound like Kierkegaard is explaining sort of the existential Big Bang. And I think that's a really wonderful way to think about it. And I don't get too much off the mark. You know, I mean, for me, the unknown and nothing have very different, very different connotations. When I think of nothingness, I think of void, and I bring a set of sensations or intuitions to the unknown that's not necessarily the same as nothing. There's in my mind, the unknown is something unfathomable and mysterious, and that I don't quite know it, but it's a sense for the infinite. Nothing. To me, that's in my mind, I get images of just utter lack, utter absence. Whereas the unknown, there seem to just be positive qualities that I can't figure out yet. So
would it make it? It does make a difference.
That's why I hesitate to use them interchangeably.
Okay.
But I'm not saying you're wrong to do it. That's just Luke projecting onto Kierkegaard.
Okay. No, and again, well, this is good because we give the audience a choice here. I like the term unknown because nothing I can't really put my head around. And I'm not so sure I'm afraid of nothing as I am afraid of the unknown. But again, that might be Bob interjecting or projecting himself into Kierkegaard.
Well, I think, we're probably recognizing a significant departure between Kierkegaard and Sartre, right? Because obviously Sartre takes up nothingness a great deal. I think it covers it in 700 pages in Being and Nothingness. So what may be nothingness in Sartre may be the unknown in Kierkegaard. That would be an interesting research topic.
I haven't read that book, so that's something I have to look forward to, I guess. I guess someday we'll be doing a podcast on that. Okay. So we have, this is under my explanation here. We have this dynamic effect, and yet there's nothing to consider as the object. It's an anxiety of what? We do not know for sure. I suggest that it's freedom as a self. In other words, we're afraid of being a self, but he doesn't yet know. And he's a self because the spirit is dreaming. So we're in this dreamy state of we really don't know where we're going or what we're becoming, and it's creating in us this sense of anxiety. So that's kind of where I think Kierkegaard is bringing us in this chapter at this point. But everything is conditioned upon the idea of the tension rather than the object. So what Kierkegaard is developing here is not so much what it is we're afraid of and what it is that we fear or that's causing the anxiety, as much as the anxiety itself. To me, this is where he's focusing on in this particular part. So the spirit is changing, but into what is it changing would be the anxiety. So as a person, I know I'm changing and I can reflect and I can see that I'm changing, but it's creating an anxiety because what am I going to be like in the future? What's going to happen to me? The decisions that I make, how will it influence who I become? So now we talk about the object a little bit. It was when the command came that it gave form to man's anxiety, his ignorance, and his innocence. It provided an object, even if only in the form of the word, he calls it, which I would say prohibition. So now Kierkegaard is bringing in an object, and he's saying, okay, you've got anxiety, but you don't know what you're anxious about. So here's something to be anxious about. Be afraid that you break the commandment. Be afraid of this commandment. Even if you don't totally, he says, even if you don't totally understand it, it's something to fear. So this is where he's injecting or interjecting an object. If we assume that the command or the prohibition awakened the desire in man, then one acquires knowledge instead of ignorance. So he's kind of building on the negative, what it is not again. In other words, if the prohibition was a temptation, there would have had to have been some knowledge as to what was being awakened. In other words, if God's prohibition awakened or was a temptation, it would have had been tempting something, and that something would have been something that would have to have existed after sin, not prior to sin. It's the way he's trying to bring it across. So it's not that this tempted anything, because it only tempts you after you break into this new explosion of being a sinner. He would have had to have known freedom, in other words, to know that he could make a choice. So Adam and Eve at this point really didn't even know they had a choice to do evil. They were still in a state of innocence. So it wasn't necessarily a temptation as much as it was simply a prohibition. So I think what they understood was very limited. I have a quotation here. He says, the prohibition induces in him anxiety, for it awakens in him freedom's possibility. So it was a possibility that the prohibition awakened. It was a prohibition that gave him an object for his anxiety. And this gave form to his anxiety, even though it wasn't in the form, or maybe only be in the form of a word. So what did the command actually do? What did this prohibition actually do? He says it awakened the possibility of man's freedom. And I take that to mean the possibility that man could do the wrong thing. Prior to this, man had no idea that there was such a thing of a choice, of a wrong choice, of doing something that made God angry, that I didn't even know I had a choice in general. But prior to this anxiety, it awakens this idea, he's saying, of the possibility of choice.
Well, this is an interesting thing. You know, there's, I don't know if it's in this section or the next section. I didn't really understand it at the time, but I think it's making sense the way that you explained it, is that he talks that, you know, an angel could be busy all day long running God's errands, but it still wouldn't have a history. And I was like, how does it not have a history? And I wonder if humans are the only entities that really can have a history, because they can make choices. And those choices are things that we are answerable for. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think that's part of it, that we can reflect on our choices. This idea of the spirit reflecting upon itself, coupled with the idea of the choices that we make, I think it may be. And I didn't fully understand that verse either about history. So on that.
Well, like there's like a physical object, right? Like an atom, atom. Does an atom have a history? You know, it just kind of follows the laws of physics, not unlike how an angel would follow the commands of God.
Right.
But it's because human individuals can actually make commitments, can make choices. And I think this is where part of the Sartre and the Simone de Beauvoir that I'm familiar with, right, is that they can etch choices into their face and into their being and develop a history is the result of that, right? Like,
okay.
I don't know. Like Sartre says, you can tell a lot about a man by by examining his face at 50 or whatever. You can see the choices that he's made in life.
So our choices, in a sense, is like writing a diary.
Yeah.
Writing a journal where we're wearing our journal on our faces.
Exactly. So then, the question becomes not so much, we've wrestled with this in the last section where we were trying to figure out why God would create beings that have hereditary sin, could sin or whatever. I mean, I think we can take it back even further. Why would God even allow there to be the preconditions for sin, right? Why would God even allow for there to be a tree that he would give a prohibition against? And I think this is an interesting question. It's like, essentially, he wants beings. It seems like he wants beings with history. He wants beings that can make commitments in some way.
Yeah.
I don't know if that, I mean, obviously that's not a very satisfactory answer, because then you go, why? Why wasn't he just content with ahistorical beings? Why wasn't he content with angels that just did his bidding? Why did he have to have ones that would develop a history through error and choice?
Well, I don't know if this helps at all, but yeah, theologically, there's a difference between the term God and between Lord. Actually, there's several different terms of Lord. But the difference is that God presents himself as Lord. And if you read it in the King James Version, you might read the word Jehovah. Or if you see in other versions, you'll see capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, opposed to capital L, lowercase O-R-D. There are actually differences in the original language. The word Lord in all capitals replies to his name, replies to his ability to have a personal relationship with man, and emphasizes his ability to have covenants with man. The Lord, in all capitals, is the one who has covenants with man, agreements with man. He is able to deal with man on that level, which is higher than any other being he has yet created.
Right.
So it helps when you kind of know that. And I know a lot of people are never taught that in Sunday school, but it makes a big difference in how you interpret the scriptures, knowing that one little factor in the Old Testament anyway.
Right. It's very easy if you start to see a cosmological hierarchy, right? And you recognize that, like, you're somewhere in between angel and devil or something like that, to be like, well, why wasn't it just all angels or something like that? It seems like, in a way, because man and God can enter into commitments and covenants to one another, that he is kind of the crown jewel in some way. I think the question then becomes, and I think that's satisfactory in some sense. I think that, in some way it's like, oh, okay, maybe being mortal and dying and straying is like worth it, because like I can relate to God in a way that an angel cannot. I think the question becomes, why did God desire that so much, right? Because then you start getting to questions of those sorts of questions may intimate that there may be some lack in God. Or you could say he had such an abundance of love that it had to go somewhere.
Yeah, that's, I think, how theologians would look at it the second way, is that it's the nature of God's love to create man. Remember, it says he created everything, and at the end it says because it was good. So God created man because it was good. It was the right thing to do. Of course, everything God does is the right thing, but you know what I mean. In human terms, God, it was an expression of God's love. Even with all the catastrophic effects and everything, it was still the net result. It was an act of love to create us, to give us the opportunity to share with God, to give man that opportunity. Now, because man slaps God in the face, doesn't negate God's love. So I think that's where we have to draw the line to say, well, should God have created man? Well, he gave him the opportunity and man slapped him in the face. So yes, he still should have created man, even if man was to turn around and slap him and spit on him, because he did literally spit in God's face when he spit in Christ's face. We know that from the crucifixion. He crucified God. But he did it anyway, even though he kind of knew that was going to bring it about. So I like your second explanation. It was a pure act of love. And to kind of dealing with that a little bit here, we talk about myth again in lesson 6. He says he's now going to examine the narrative of Genesis in the terms of myth. Now, in his day, and I mentioned this last time, in his day, myth probably was considered to be more like the Greek myths, in which they were more fantastic story of the gods, like Hercules. So should we equate Adam and Eve to the same stories as we do Hercules and Romulus and Remus? No, it's not the same thing. It's not a myth. So if that's the only definition we have of myth, then we'd have to say, no, the story of Adam and Eve is not a myth. But we have a different definition today of it. Today we don't really see these stories in the same light. We see them in a valid literary expressions of how man perceives his history through his faith in his God. So we can't stand in judgment of these people who wrote the stories, because, and I'm trying to think of who it was again. I can't think of his name. I'll hopefully think of his name later. The idea of to demythologize the Bible, to take all the myths out of the Bible, what would you be left with? You can't, because the myth is synthesized in with the history. It's part of the history. You can't tell the story of the Jews without telling the myths along with it. And myths don't mean they're untrue. It simply means it's part of the way they perceive the history. So for us, it's best for us to see it as a literary expression of how the Jews perceive their God and his interaction in history, perceive themselves in their relationship with God. But I have to remind us that this isn't the way Kierkegaard is using the term myth. I use it a lot more favorably, like when I teach the Bible, I use the term myth in a very positive way. But Kierkegaard is using it more in a negative term. He begins the story with Adam and Eve, and he talks about the rib, being removed from Adam, and retells that story. This reflects an intimate relationship that Adam had with Eve, or that Eve had with Adam. But yet he says it's an external one, for she was a separate individual. So we were talking about how does he view Adam and Eve? He views them as separate individuals, two separate beings. And one of the questions that I have is that, does Eve inherit the same thing as Adam had, because she is a
fission of him?
A product, right. A product of him, a fission of him. Does she inherit all the things that he had? Which is a question that just kind of remains unanswered. But
well, I mean, it's essentially kind of like, I mean, they're twins in some way, right?
And in some way, I guess they would be like closer than brother and sister. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. But he says that every man is the race, which he'll explain later. In this, he explains it. I think he explains it right now. Man is the individual, but he's also the race. This is an important concept that he will continue to reinforce through this whole thing. So we have to keep that distinction. He says that the story allows something inward to take place outwardly. Now, I thought this kind of an interesting way to put it, and I didn't quite understand it exactly what he was getting at, but maybe he's getting at the same thing I just said, that it was a way of man expressing his inexpressible relationship with God through stories, through words, through these so-called myths. And I'm wondering if that's what he was getting at by speaking about it, or if he was meant something completely different that I missed. Did you, if you got anything out of that, if you notice that, did you get anything out of that where he says that the story allows something inward to take place outwardly?
I'd have to struggle to try to, I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay. So, and I didn't know either. So I just kind of saw it in parallel to what I had just said about how the story or how the myth relates to their personal inward experiences. Okay. Rather than an isolated historical thing that happened, it's telling us a deeper story.
You keep talking. I'll try to find where he says it. You don't know about what page he says it on, do you?
Lesson 6, pretty much the close beginning of lesson 6.
Okay, I'll take a look while you do that.
So he talks about sin and sinfulness again. He doesn't deny that sinfulness is propagated through the generations. So he's saying, as a member of the race, we do inherit sinfulness. We have to note carefully that he's saying we don't inherit sin so much as we inherit sinfulness. He makes that distinction. Sin, on the other hand, has a different story. Sinfulness moves in that quantitative way, that quantitative category, whereas sin moves in a qualitative leap by the individual. So since sin came from Adam, do we consider that there was already an inherited sin? But did she inherit what did she, Eve, inherit by becoming part of Eve's body? So I kind of asked that question a little ahead of time. My answer with question marks is anxiety. So she inherited, I think, not so much sin or sinfulness because that hadn't yet taken place. So what Eve inherited was his anxiety. And he says that, but don't get me wrong, he says, anxiety is not something bad. It's not really an imperfection. I think the way Luke and I were discussing it is that this idea of anxiety can be very positive. It's what motivates us, what generates us, what causes us to reflect upon ourselves in order to hopefully improve ourselves. And then he says something that's very interesting about the serpent. He says, how do we deal with the serpent? He admits he doesn't know exactly how the serpent fits into all of this. The serpent is some kind of an external influence. And then he quotes James a little bit, which we did in the upbuilding discourses, the 18 upbuilding discourses, where he says about James, James says that God tempts no man and is not tempted by anyone, but each person is tempted by himself. So in other words, the temptation lies within us. The quality of what is tempted is within us. It's not something external. The temptation is to exercise our will over God's. So we're tempted to do what we want to do rather than to do what God wants us to do. So that's what the temptation is all about. The temptation is all about tempting our will, not our anxiety. So is the temptation then coming from the serpent, or is it within man already? So is something temptation carries that Adam and Eve are carrying around with them? This would mean that the serpent would play a completely different role in the matter. Did he actually tempt the desires of Eve? So she was deceived but not tempted. So we'll deal with that. I think Luke's got something. Do you have something, Luke?
Well, I do have the passage that I struggled with earlier when you were talking about the inward and the outward. And it's in the third paragraph of section 6. And he says, now follows the prohibition and the judgment. But the serpent was more cunning than all the animals of the field. He seduced the woman. Even though one may call this a myth, it neither disturbs thought nor confuses the concept as does a myth of the understanding. The myth allows something that is inward to take place outwardly. Just based on that alone, and I don't know how congruent it is with everything that you've said so far. I'm just, I'm improvising here. Mm-hmm. It seems like to me that the myth is, doesn't conflict with our conceptual understanding of what's going on, and it's sort of perhaps a picture, a way to work out these complex concepts via sort of a picture reality. So whether or not they obtained or not, I'm not sure it really matters, in the sense of so long as they allow us to make sense of innocence, the fall, guilt, and all of that. But they have, so it's not like a myth of the understanding, which totally confuses concepts. So what do you think of what I'm saying right there?
As a matter of
contra to everything else you've already said?
No, I think it's parallel to everything I've said. It's in agreement, because what I was saying is that the historical is there in pieces, but that's not what this is about. This is a writing that's more than the historical. This writing is about what's going on in the world between God and man. And this is the only way to explain it, is through a mythical concept. If you just told history wouldn't really say this is a relationship between man and God. It would just be a list and string of facts. But this is something different. So we need to focus. I've stopped really trying to prove whether it's historical or not. I find that a total waste of time, as does Kierkegaard. It's more important that I get from this story something that's going to make me a better person, something that's going to make me a holier person, a more religious person, a more understanding person, a better Christian. So I read it for that reason. I don't read it to become more knowledgeable, for some abstract knowledge. I want to know more about myself and who I am and what makes me tick on the inside. This does that for me.
Yeah.
So that's
a very interesting conception. Yeah, it's a very interesting conception of myth. I think I'd love to see some more research on how Kierkegaard distinguishes myth from, say, the other Greek and Roman myths or whatnot. Yeah, and Kierkegaard warns against us from the obsession with trying to authenticate every little detail of the Bible, right? That this is a massive distraction. But like, we go on these Indiana Jones like archaeological crusades to prove, this is Jesus's tomb, and this cloth was the burial shroud, and this is the exact place of where the fall occurred, or whatever. That this sort of excites an aesthetic sense of the imagination, but we're not really making any sort of existential gains in the process.
That's right. It's a distraction, a gigantic distraction from what we really need to do. Okay, and then we move along here. I get back into the idea where I actually put the idea of the explosion here. Like an explosion, it needs necessary ingredients of a sufficient quantity and a catalyst. But no one ingredient is sufficient by itself to have an explosion. So when did sin happen? It didn't happen at one particular moment, because like a step, it didn't happen when this happened, or it didn't happen when this happened. It happened when all these things came together. One decisive moment, the qualitative leap. The qualitative leap. So what are we trying to show is that anxiety is the presupposition of hereditary sin. This is the whole point. I'm trying to bring us back to where we began. Anxiety is the presupposition of hereditary sin. So that's what he's trying to show. Hopefully we've made some progress with that. What does he mean here? What he does mean here is that anxiety must have existed prior to hereditary sin, not as a cause, but as an ontological connection or a truth. You can't have one without the other, in other words. It's one of the necessary ingredients. It has to precede sin, anxiety. And then this is where we get into the idea of this sensuality and sex he talks about. He says, when does sex enter into all of this? Because I know in some, in the Roman Catholic idea, the sin was actually, I think the myth is actually explaining the sexual act, the first sexual act that Adam has with Eve. And that's why the sin is propagated, because we propagate our race through sex. And therefore, there's some connection with sex, with race, with propagation, right? That's kind of where that sexual idea came about. So he might be telling us here that there was some sexuality connected with the sin, but we need to look closer at exactly what he's saying here. It may not be exactly what you might think when we're saying that the connection of sex and sin take place together, because the synthesis, this synthesis of the body, there is a connection between the spirit, the body, and the sin. So prior to the sin, there was no mention of any awareness of body sexuality. Adam and Eve, there is no mention anywhere in Genesis that they knew anything about physical organs. And where does this take place? Well, they didn't know they were naked until when? After the fall. It's not like they said, hey, Eve, you're naked, right? Oh, yeah, I know it, but I choose to be naked. They didn't even know they were naked. They had no, and I don't even know if they had intercourse prior to the fall. So I don't know that. It doesn't mention that. They had no children prior to the fall. So perhaps they had no intercourse either. So maybe it didn't take place until they realized they were different sexually. So don't know. Those are all kinds of things in the story that we don't know about. But they did know they were very different physically. But we know nothing more than that. At least Genesis isn't telling us anymore. In Innocence, Adam was dreaming. He was in this dreaming state, wondering of the possibilities of the changes or the freedom or the whatevers that were not yet actual. So Adam was still in this dreamy state. Because of the spirit was still dreaming, the synthesis has not yet actualized completely. So this body and mind had not yet completed itself, and maybe even today it hasn't yet completed itself. But it was far from completing itself prior to the fall. But then he goes on, and I don't want to get too much into this. He talks about sinfulness is not the same thing as sensualness. I think we know that if we read the Psalms, I think it's in, in David's, oh boy, now I can't think of what it is. In the Psalms, he talks about the nakedness of his wife, talks about her breasts being, beautiful monuments and beautiful thing. He talks about the human body. It's very sensual, but it's not sinful. So Kierkegaard is trying to mention that it's not like sensuality between a husband and a wife is something sinful, which is something I think that's propagated by the Catholic Church. I think they give the idea that sensuality between a man and a woman is bad. It's a sin. But there's no mention of that here. And certainly Kierkegaard doesn't agree with that.
Well, I will say this. I will say this. That is up for dispute just a little bit in some of the other places that Kierkegaard writes. Like, Kierkegaard himself had the opportunity to have a sensual sexual relationship, right? And he eschewed it.
Yeah.
And I think we can sort of presuppose that his productivity as an author might have been the result of sublimated libidinal energy. But there are parts in his journals where I'll have to find it because and maybe I'll do a quick search right here, where Kierkegaard seems to entertain the notion of universal human extinction. That to continue to propagate the race involves dragging souls down from heaven that will then fall and sin and then experience perdition. That actually an ideal state of things would be for the human race to stop replicating, and so there could just be everybody could be with God again. I'll have to find it, but it is buried somewhere in his journals. Have you ever heard that before?
Oh, in his journals?
Have you ever heard what I'm talking about? Do you think I'm talking crazy stuff?
No, because I remember reading something here about the angels. So let's see. I don't want to make sure that I didn't. Oh, okay. Let me read this. Maybe this is what you were thinking here. Free responsibility. Power of God to resurrection. Yeah, okay. It says, according to Kierkegaard, he believes that the resurrection has the perfect spirit and the sexual differences are canceled in the resurrection. And we will be like angels in that manner. And I think what he's quoting is from Matthew 22, verse 29. But Jesus answered and said unto them, ye do err, not knowing the scriptures, nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry, nor are given in marriage, but are as angels in heaven. Does that sound familiar to what you were thinking about, or was it something different even than that?
I mean, I could see. Yeah, but there's something else. There's something else, and I'll have to find it. You just keep going. I'll find it.
Okay.
Just keep going.
So along the lines of that, he says, freedom's possibility is not, the possibility of freedom is not in the ability to choose between the good and the evil. Freedom's possibility is to be able to choose between good and evil. And this is kind of like one of those mental puzzles you have to kind of read a few times over. What's the difference between the ability and to be able to do something? And the best I could make of that is that freedom's possibility is not the ability of choice as a capacity in the sense of a noun. I have the ability, I have this as a capacity to do something, but it's rather the permission that you are able to do it. You know, like there's a lot of things we have the capacity to do, but we're not able to do them. So he's trying to distinguish from the ability to make a choice. You may have the capacity to do it, but you're not free to do it. So he's just kind of giving us the different sides of that. He talks about the logical system of Hegel. Back to Hegel again. One can say that possibility passes directly into actuality. But in real life, there has to be an intermediate. Possibility has to come through anxiety as the intermediate. It is the dynamic process that deals with this, with how we handle the possibility. Now, I have to tell you, I know you're searching for something, but this text confused me. Because
all right, I'll come back to it. I was still mid-search, but okay. So where are we again?
I'll read. Let me read this again to you. In a logical system, which is Hegel, one can say that possibility passes directly into actuality. You go from the possible right into the actual. It's a leap. It's a flip-flop. But in real life, there has to be an intermediate from the possibility to the actuality. Possibility has come through anxiety as the intermediate. It is the dynamic process that deals with how we handle possibility. But then I got to thinking, I says, wait a second, Soren. The text is confusing here because he sounds as though he's contradicting himself. Isn't sin a leap where you go from the possibility to the actuality without an intermediate? Isn't his whole argument that temptation doesn't cause the leap? That there is no intermediate step. If it goes through anxiety, then can we still say it's not a leap, but a progression? But he actually falls short of saying that. So does this go back to the idea of an explosion? That yes, anxiety is one of the ingredients, but it's not really a way to get from possibility to actuality, but it's one of the things that happens in this explosion. Or am I just...
I mean, how separable are these elements, right?
Yeah, like, that's the issue.
Can you... Because you can have anxiety without innocence, right? Because it's not like we stop having anxiety after we have the fall. So it seems like anxiety and innocence are separable. And if they're separable, taking a different perspective, you could talk about innocence being, depending on how you arrange the elements in this sort of explosion or something like that, one could take the spot of the intermediary. There's not necessarily the case that temptation has to be the intermediary, or anxiety is the intermediary or something like that, that you can have this direct transition from possibility to actuality.
Unless he's saying that there has to be a change that takes place. There has to be some kind of a change that takes place. I call it that explosion, but maybe Kierkegaard is thinking in different terms, more of a synthesis or something. Well, no, that would be more Hegel's idea. But that something you go from sin, go from innocence to sin, and there's nothing between the two. That's what Kierkegaard is saying.
So, we made this pretty obvious in the case of Adam and Eve, that right there, the prohibition not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil was their prohibition that awakened the dreaming spirit towards possibility. Can we more concretely say what that prohibition is for Bob and Luke or anyone else? Like, what is that prohibition for your average human being?
Oh, okay. Disobedience. In other words, when God, it could be in the form of a law, a commandment, a prohibition.
But it has to be but it has to be disobedience to a particular prohibition. Because not every prohibition is going to be
what it actually is
worth obeying.
Yeah, maybe I'm getting to the end of the book, or maybe I'm going into another book. But for me, what he's getting at is for man to exercise his freedom over obedience to God. In other words, I'm going to do it my way, not your way, God. And it comes in just any form possible. So this is where I think he differs from Sartre. I think Kierkegaard is saying for man to exercise his freedom in any way is sin, because he wants to become independent of God. And that's how he does it. I exercise my freedom so I can become independent of God. Now, Jesus gives us the exact opposite. In the garden, he prays, and he doesn't say, this is what I want, God, and I'm your son, so you got to do it my way. What he echoes is what Kierkegaard, I think, is trying to say is not my will, but thine. So, oops, got that loud screeching all of a sudden again. Oh, it's gone. Okay. It just comes and goes. We've had that problem earlier, but seems to be. Are you still on? Oh, okay. Okay. So that's, for me, that's what it means. It means that it is when I exercise my right, my right to freedom, to be independent of God. I can be my individual and do it my way. And yes, there's a lot to be said for that. And, we can say we can become independent beings and we can progress. But theologically speaking, as we're related to God, that's not what really God wants from us. God doesn't want us to be independent of him. He wants us to be, and I know this is going to sound terrible to some ears, he wants us to be servants. But servants in the sense that Christ is, because we get to serve God. So theologically speaking, Paul says, you are a servant. Your choice is this: serve God or serve Satan. The only two choices. You're going to be a servant either way. So which one do you want to serve? So when we think we're going to be independent, what we're saying is we're independent of God, but that puts us automatically in the place of serving the devil, serving Satan, serving the world.
You got to serve somebody, right?
You're going to serve somebody. Okay, so on to the last section here. The last little piece here is anxiety and freedom. There's a difference between anxiety and freedom. Anxiety is not freedom, and freedom is not anxiety. Somehow he says that and he uses this term entangled, which I like that term. They're entangled together, which means that they're all working together, creating what we need for that explosion. They're all entangled together. Freedom, anxiety, innocence, ignorance. Freedom deals with choice. I can choose something or not choose something. Anxiety is worry about whether I make the correct choice. And there's a tension between the two. Anxiety is concern over making the wrong choice and what changes it might bring about in my life. It's fear over the unknown. What if I don't choose what's going to happen? Fear over that. Fear over not making the choice. So anxiety and freedom, I see as like heat and fire, where fire is freedom and anxiety is the heat. In other words, you can't have one without the other. You have the potential of freedom, you're going to have anxiety along with it. It comes as a set. If sin comes into the world by necessity, back to what Kierkegaard says, if it comes in by necessity, where you had to sin, you have to sin, then there's no anxiety. Nor can there be anxiety if it comes into the world through some abstraction. The idea is that sin just happens. I think this is what he's getting at. He's kind of skipping the in-between thing. Sin just happens. It can't come through necessity, for then man had to have sinned, and it would not have been a result of freedom and choice, and there would be no reason to have anxiety. This would give support to the idea of determinism, where you don't have a choice of anything. God chooses who's saved, and he chooses who's going to hell. That's the predestination is found in Calvinism. John Calvin was kind of famous for that, but it's also found elsewhere. And Kierkegaard says this here. He says that it's stupid to try to come up with a logical explanation of how sin came into the world. He says, when someone asks a stupid question, care must be taken not to answer him, lest him who answers becomes just as stupid as the questioner. That's one I've got to memorize, because I've been lured into answering stupid questions so many times. And it turns out it just makes me look as stupid as the question. What did you think of that quotation? Did you jump on that as well, or did I just kind of pick up on that? Because I've been...
Oh, yeah. Well, because that's precisely what I did in our last session, right? Is that I was like, Bob, give me the answers. Come on, man. And I was like, I did precisely what Kierkegaard is advising you not to do. I was the one asking such stupid questions.
No, I don't think so. But that's anyway. He tells us to be cautious as teachers that we don't